We're going to start in just a few more seconds. I can see people are still logging in. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our joint panel presentation, Designing Accessible and Inclusive Online Tutorials, organized by the ACRL Distance and Online Learning Section Conference Program Planning Committee with co-chairs Melissa Atkinson and Ashley Hoffman, and the DOLS Discussion Group co-chairs Chelsea Nesvig and John Stewarts. Please mute your microphone and turn off your video for the recording. You can ask questions in the chat and we can answer your questions at the end. And I'm going to introduce the panelists today. First, we have Darlene Aguilar, is the Instructional Design Librarian at Loyola Marymount University. She has a Master of Education in Learning Design and Technology and has led many accessibility initiatives in her library because she is passionate about helping all students learn.
Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Thanks. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. So let's start with my definition of accessibility in the education setting. To me, accessibility means breaking down barriers to learning for all students. And we must remember that all students have barriers to learning. Fortunately, making content that is accessible for students with disabilities tends to also increase accessibility for all students because that content tends to be more organized, easy to navigate, mobile friendly, which is important, and just well designed overall. So last summer, I redesigned a game we used in our rhetorical arts workshop for first year students, and we call it the Radar Challenge game. And it helps students practice using the radar framework to critically evaluate their sources. And radar, by the way, means rationale, authority, date, accuracy, and relevance. So let me show you what that looked like. So this is the redesigned version of the game, and it's based on the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire game show. Students basically would read an article abstract, and answer 10 questions that come from the radar framework. And then they have the 3 lifelines that help them to the correct answer, and they can earn points along the way. So students work in teams usually when they do this radar challenge, and they get pretty competitive in class just to see who gets more points. So it's a very fun and effective practice activity. There were several components to the redesign that helped increase the accessibility. The first was readability. The old design included a very difficult to read article on fracking. So we ended up choosing an article that was easier to read while still being scholarly. Similarly, I considered the readability of the tutorial itself and eliminated any jargon. So this provides more inclusivity for people whose first language is not English. Font types can also affect readability, like for people with dyslexia. So I use sans serif fonts like Arial throughout the tutorial. The next consideration was color contrast. So to design the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style game, I adapted images from Rusnak Creative, which licenses their various game templates under Creative Commons. And I'm going to share their website link in the chat after my presentation, just because they have such great game templates. So I adapted their images to fit my specific project better, and that required making the contrast between the images and the text stronger to help people with low vision read the text easier. I tend to use 2 tools to help me check the contrast for my tutorials. The first tool is the contrast checker by WebAIM. And let me show you what that one looks like in case you weren't aware of it. And I'll put this link in the chat later too. So basically here, you just enter the hex number for the foreground and background colors that you want to use, and then it'll tell you if it passes or fails accessibility standards based on the type of text. The second tool I use is the Color Contrast Analyzer Chrome extension. That's a mouthful, but it's a Chrome extension basically. So you would need to download this tool, and then it gets added to the top right. It's I don't know if you can see the 3 colors here. That's the extension. So it'll be added on Chrome, and then when you use it, what you do is open the site that you want to check, and then click on the extension. And you get options to check a page range or the whole page. So I'm just going to click whole page here, and it gets started. So you see there's a status, and it takes about a minute to analyze the entire page, but it'll end up looking like this. So anything that is outlined in white has high contrast and can be read. Now let's talk about tool features. I made this game with Articulate Storyline, which I use for many of my tutorials. And it's important to understand the accessibility features of the digital learning tools that you decide to use to create your tutorials or any digital learning object. With Storyline, I know that I can add headings, alt text. I can change the reading order in the slide. I also know that interactive elements like the drag and drops are not accessible on Storyline, so I avoid using those. And they aren't accessible because you need a mouse to complete that interaction, right? You need a mouse to click and drag an object to another area of the screen. It's important to understand that not everybody can use a mouse for various reasons. So tutorials need to be keyboard accessible. And that means basically that you should be able to navigate the entire tutorial just using the keyboard. The digital divide is also a concern. I use Storyline because it's mobile friendly, and typically being mobile friendly also means that it's accessible. Many students use their phones or tablets to complete their schoolwork, so it's important to have a tool that's responsive and serves all devices. And then it's also best practice to provide tutorials in different formats. That's one of the principles of the Universal Design for Learning framework. So in case like technology fails, or maybe the student doesn't have a stable internet connection, or maybe the tutorial or digital learning object is just not as accessible as you thought it was, right? Because no one's perfect. I end up providing an accessible Word document version of the tutorials that I make, and they can be downloaded and completed offline if needed. Right? So those are my major considerations when I did the redesign. But I'm going to wrap this up with some advice because I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed with accessibility. It's important to learn as much as you can about making things accessible, but realize that it's a learning process and you just need to take that first step. Using accessibility checking tools like the ones that I shared, and I'm going to put in the chat later, that's a great way to start, but also realize that no tool is perfect. I'm still learning myself and I'm trying to get better each day. And I think my next step for all of my tutorials will be to have people with disabilities test out my tutorials and see where I can improve. And I also have a handout that includes accessibility best practices. It includes some of the tools that I was talking about and other tools as well for checking accessibility. And it also includes some websites where you can go and learn more about accessibility if you're interested in improving. And I use those exact sites to learn myself, so they're really great. I'll put the links in the chats that I talked about and the document as well. But that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. Our next presenter is Elizabeth Jean Brumfield. She is the Distance Services Librarian and head of the Northwest Houston Center Library at Prairie View A&M University. Her certificates in training and accessibility with a focus on auditory disabilities include the Texas DLA Digital Accessibility Certification, the micro-credential certificate, Inclusive Teaching for Equitable Learning from the Association of College and University Educators, and the Digital Inclusion Universal Design Learning Certificate from the Center for Instruction, Innovation, and Technology Services, CITS, Community of Practice. Elizabeth Jean, you are muted, so you need to unmute if you're talking.
I'm sorry, and my video. So sorry. So my focus is auditory disabilities, and this is important when you're talking about accessibility because we want to be able to serve all of our students. And many students and others do not disclose their hearing loss or their deafness. It's estimated that anywhere from 30 to 50% of students do not disclose that they have hearing problems. Deaf and hard of hearing students are not all the same. Some use sign language, some use speech, many use both. The communication preference and their accommodation needs change across setting and context and even change over time. Some accommodations may differ. Some use visual descriptions, need visual descriptions. Some need extended time for reading. Some need interpreters, caption media, media descriptions, and more. Some accommodations that work for students in a physical classroom may not be a good fit for students in an online classroom. This means that access is not a one-size-fits-all formula. So deafness is often considered an all or nothing condition, when actually it is a degree of hearing loss determined by the level at which one hears sounds. So in the chart in the white, these are different levels of when you're the medical test for hearing. These are different levels of hearing loss. And it is a person who tests within the 70 to lower are considered having some type of deafness. It could be deaf in one ear or both ears. It could be deafness in a certain frequency. Speech and hearing tests determine the accuracy of word perception at the level the person hears. So even if a person hears at this level, they can tell their sound, they may not be able to understand the words. And this is very important when you're working with persons who have deaf or hard of hearing. So some of the concerns when you are getting ready to create tutorials or presentations, you want to think about the different auditory concerns. Is a person hard of hearing? Are they completely deaf? Do they have ringing in the ear? Does a person use sign language? Is the sign language American Sign Language, or is it MCE, manually coded English? For some deaf, English is not their first language. Their first language may be ASL. Learning to read means connecting what a word looks like to how it sounds. So the text may not be understood, which is why it's a recommendation that you use images in your tutorials or presentation. Zoom and communication platforms. Closed captioning problems. A lot of times you'll see the words do not make any sense because the captioning is not correct, or there's no captioning. When you are planning on creating tutorials, is the person going to be viewing the tutorial or presentation in a group setting in a location where it's a large room that they may have to look at from a distance? Will they be using their phone? These are some considerations. And also, developers sometimes consider the web as only a visual medium, and they focus on compliance of ADA for screen readers, but they forget about other disabilities such as hearing. Some best practices: try to use speech to text as much as possible, include subtitles and captions, use visual attention strategies, multimedia, graphics. As I mentioned previously, deaf persons associate images with the words. This is, if a word is not common, then it's good to try and do a description or use an image. Use large, simple fonts that can be read by most individuals, even if they're in a large room. Control the speed of speech, animations, and slide transitions to allow persons to grasp content. Build in pauses. So the person, a deaf person or a hard of hearing person, they may need that extra time to connect the words. And note taking is difficult to do when you're trying to keep up. Make sure that the videos are captioned correctly, as I mentioned, and audio sounds like laughter. The description, this is laughter. If you tell a joke, a deaf person may not know that just from reading the text that it was funny. So including things, the extra additional sounds is important. There are, YouTube is, of course, a source you can use. They do free transcriptions, I'm sorry. And Sonic is an international one like YouTube that translates and transcribes. Preferably use earbuds or a headset. Computer microphones may be too far away to pick up your voice clearly. And computer microphones also can pick up room noise and vibrations from your desk. Additional best practices: encourage speakers to talk normally, not shouting or whispering. Some deaf and hard of hearing persons use speech reading to gain more understanding, and shouting or whispering can distort the natural movements of the mouth. Repeat and rephrase periodically. Make transcripts available. If possible, provide notes beforehand. Record the session. This allows a person to go back and review what might have been missed. And include sign language if you can. There's new technology which is making it possible to translate ASL to text and vice versa. And we use what is called Sign-All, which does exactly that. It translates sign language into text. And this is a screen of what it would look like when you would sit down to the computer. This is a tutorial that teaches a person who is not an ASL, native ASL, how to do ASL. This is from the Sign-All Learn, the technology that we have. This is one of our staff persons who is actually using the tutorial, doing the sign language. These are different. You can see it uses artificial intelligence, and what we did, we had native deaf persons come in and to help program the technology. So this is a very short video of a native signer, a deaf person, programming the technology. Some other tools that are very helpful for creating your presentations and also working with persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. Google Pronounce. What you do is you put in the word, and it does an animation of what the mouth would look like speaking. So a person who is trying to learn what the sound and what the lip reading would look like can see that from this little animation. Google Live Transcribe does real-time transcripts and captions. EarSpy is an app you can download that serves as a hearing aid. Ava is a group transcription app. If you're a person who is deaf or hard of hearing and you're in a group and you can't hear all 5 people, say there's 5 people, can't hear all 5 people at one time. So you have them all download the app, and it does a transcription of all of the people within the group and what they're saying and who said it. Roger Voice is a lab transcription of phone calls. Singly offers videos on phones, so it displays images that assigned a person who is deaf can see from the word. And then TAP is SOS is an emergency service for persons who can't speak. And then I already mentioned YouTube and Sonic that does captioning. And here are some resources that are included. And I thank you. That's if you have any questions, I'll be there to answer.
Thank you, Elizabeth Jean. Our next presenter is Tessa Withorn. She's the online learning librarian at California State University, Dominguez Hills. She's primarily responsible for creating and assessing accessible online tutorials.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks for joining me today to talk about creating accessible infographics. And I want to just give a happy Pride shout out. So my slides are rainbow themed, but I'll be taking you through some practical tips as well as some other considerations. So to set a little bit of the context, I really like using infographics to visualize different information literacy concepts. So in order to create these infographics, I use a really low cost program that's cloud-based as well called PictoChart. Maybe you've heard it before. There's also programs like Canva and similar ones, but I really like these because they're very user-friendly to use. It's much easier than Photoshop. There's a really low bar of entry to be able to start creating these things. It includes libraries of free graphics and templates as well. So it really doesn't take too much time to build out these infographics. So I include these infographics on my library's website where I have other tutorials and digital learning objects, but I also integrate them into interactive tutorials as well. So for these tutorials, I use SpringShare's LibWizard platform. And during the acquisition process of purchasing this tool, our IT department requires that you submit a product accessibility template or a VPAT. So this is something that you can request from SpringShare, and it really goes through all of the different levels of the extent to which this tool is accessible. So this meets some basic requirements, but of course it's not a perfect tool. There are some things like Darlene mentioned about tab orders and how users navigate through the tutorial. But I also want to mention here that if you're hesitant about using LibWizard because of accessibility, I do recommend that you can also use a quiz feature. So instead of having that split screen, like one side being an embedded web browser and the other being text, you can also create sequential tutorials that have maybe a video as well as some questions. And then that is also really mobile friendly as well. So there's different applications that you can use within LibWizard that have different accessibility needs. So in these tutorials, I use a variety of videos and infographics. And so this example here is about reading a research article. So they look at or review an anatomy of a research article infographic, and then later they apply what they've learned about these different parts with a real example. So why use infographics in the first place? I think this is also a part of providing multiple means of representation, which is a key component of universal design for learning. So UDL, of course, also encourages instructors to think about how to motivate students. So this might be by providing materials that are relevant to their needs, as well as multiple means of action or expression. So this can be hard to implement in a brief asynchronous tutorial, but some things could include providing different multiple choice questions or short answer questions so learners can, show their comprehension in different ways. But then, of course, providing infographics provides multiple means of representation, right? So this could mean that users, like to read infographics that are text-based and visual. So I've actually conducted some user testing of my library tutorials with students, especially students with disabilities as well. So many of them, students report that they prefer videos, but actually when they actually looked through the page and saw these infographics, they said that they were concise and easy to read as opposed to large blocks of text. So I think students don't always think about infographics as being part of their learning style, but it also helps students kind of move through the content. So one of the first things I consider when creating an infographic is using accessible language. So I like to use Writing for the Web as a framework to think intentionally about how text is presented. This framework actually comes from the legal world, where we want laws and policies to be written in a language that most people can comprehend or understand. So thinking about that, the reader enter point to text. So this includes, chunking out content. You can see that in this infographic where the paragraphs are clearly chunked. Using active voice is also really important. That makes it easier to read. Using short sentences and paragraphs. I think Darlene talked about this too in her tip sheet, but using bullets and numbered lists, clear headings, and then also using those images and diagrams of multiple means of representation, as well as using a lot of white space. So making sure that your content kind of follows these best practices for design in general is going to make your materials more inclusive and accessible for all students. For text of infographics, you also want to make sure that that's easy to read. So as much as possible, font should be, at least 12-point font, if not more. And then using sans serif fonts, as we've discussed previously, but I want to give a shout out to Lato. I really like that font, as well as Open Sans. And these are just easier to read and also help with students who may have dyslexia or other vision needs. And it's also helpful, I know sometimes in like PictoChart and these other tools, we really want to go crazy with all these cool different fonts, but really trying to keep it to 2 or 3 different fonts makes it more accessible as well. And thinking about how to create visuals for your infographics, I think icons and basic shapes can be really powerful. So in this example, this is another infographic that I created about different types of cognitive bias. So you can see the heading here of the type of bias, as well as a brief definition, and then an example that might resonate with students. And then the image really expands on this concept by visualizing it in a different way. And it makes that illustrative example easier for students to learn from. And then I know there's a little overlap. So, Darlene talked about this too, but I'll just give another shout out to the WebAIM contrast color checker. This is really important to do before you kind of finalize your infographic to make sure that the background text and the text color is easy to read. So, WebAIM creates that really great contrast ratio. So you can see very quickly if it passes different web content accessibility guidelines. So in order to do this, I also really like using this like HTML color codes to quickly get the hex code. So you can just create a little screenshot, identify the color, and then plug it into WebAIM. So it only takes a few minutes to check, but that's an important factor before you get started. So once the infographic is created, I use Adobe Acrobat Pro to remediate the rest of the PDF. So with this program, there's on the right-hand side, you see this little accessibility, the universal sign for accessibility. And then it creates this panel where you can do an accessibility check. So it takes a few minutes, but it will kind of like show different aspects of how the PDF is accessible. So some of them are really easy to fix, like, making sure that the PDF has a title or that it's tagged as a PDF in general. But there's also a few checks that have to be done manually. So this includes that color contrast, but also reading order. So for the reading order, this can sometimes start out a little funky, but really it's showing how a screen reader will go throughout the text. So I think it's really helpful when you click on that reading order panel, it will give you some options. So I actually recommend clearing all the preset settings and then creating that order from scratch. So it's pretty easy. You just kind of click and drag a box around the element that you're trying to tag, and then you mark it as a heading 1 or a paragraph or an image. So then you can rearrange in the panel on the left the order in which it appears. So this is a pretty straightforward example. It's kind of easy to set that order. Sometimes it can be a little complicated if you're doing infographics that are maybe like a flow chart or kind of different structures, but you can at least kind of use that reading order as an example. So then you can set alternative text for images in Acrobat Pro. So when it's tagged as that image, it will give you the option to include alt text. So this should be as descriptive as possible. So for example, in this image that I have here on this infographic, I put first page of an article with a section at the top header for article information, and then the other sections as well. So you're not necessarily replicating like red box at the top. You're really setting the context for users who are relying on that alternative text to have additional meaning. And then finally, it's always a good idea to check accessibility of your PDF with a screen reader. So I think the one that I've found that's easiest to use, it works well with Adobe Acrobat Pro, which is JAWS. So this requires a license, but many universities have access to it anyway via, assistive technology labs or different, software requests that you can make. It is only for Windows though. So I also want to mention VoiceOver, which is a built-in tool for Mac that you can find in the accessibility features there. And there's also browser extensions. One that I've used is called Chromebox for Chrome. So there are different tools that you can use, but it's helpful to check with those tools. So hopefully this gave you a really quick rundown of how to create accessible infographics, but of course I would be happy to answer any questions at the end, and I'll drop my email in the chat as well. I'll be happy to chat over email as well.
Thank you, Tessa. Unfortunately, one of our presenters has a power outage where she is. So we are going to start asking the moderated questions, and then we'll get to your questions that you put in chat. And also, there will be a feedback form for you to fill out, and that will be in the chat for you to click on. So the first question is, what accessibility challenges did you experience in building your digital learning object or objects? Darlene?
So one of the challenges is trying to create an equivalent accessible version, that's a different format. So I mentioned that I make a Word document for as a different format for my storyline projects. But when it comes to revealing the answers, that's where it gets tricky, because I don't want to put all the answers on the Word document in case students figure out that the answers are there. So what I end up doing is kind of a workaround. I have students email me their responses, and then I would email them back the answers and whether they were correct or not. And that's the best I can come up with for now, because I do use Storyline and Word documents in various other tutorials and ones that are embedded in courses and are worth a grade. So that's just one of the struggles that I have.
Did anyone else want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, I'll just add, finding the right tools, right? I'm chatting with some people about, are there alternatives to Adobe? Are there alternatives to these different things? So I think there's some technical and resource related challenges, especially if you're at an institution that doesn't support accessibility as much. So finding those kind of free alternatives, I think, is kind of a challenge, but definitely a worthwhile pursuit.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
Did you?
Yes, I was going to say the challenge, I think, captioning is the cost. There's not there. Everyone has it free, and the ones that aren't, that are free, you have to go. It's very time consuming going through and rewriting transcripts.
Yeah, I can back her up on that. I correct the captioning on my YouTube videos all the time, and it's maybe for a 3 to 5 minute video, it can take up to an hour just to get all the captioning correct.
I'll just chime in and add, I'm a big fan of scripts. So usually I make my videos verbatim. So I just kind of copy and paste the script into YouTube's automated caption generator. So you still have to go back and tweak it a little bit. But if you're nervous about captions, think about your script and use that as well.
Okay, so the next question is, what technology or tools do you find helpful when creating accessible and inclusive digital learning objects? I know a lot of them have been mentioned, but maybe we can recap.
So
Darlene, sorry.
I saw somebody on the chat just mention NVDA as a free alternative to JAWS, and I'm going to second that. I use NVDA because I have I use primarily the PC, not a Mac. So Mac has the built-in. Actually, I think PC had a built-in one too, but I really like NVDA, and it's free. And there's worksheets out there that tell you how to operate it. And then aside from that, one tool that I did not mention that I always suggest to beginners is the Totally extension. And I wonder if I can find it right now. It's another extension on Chrome, and it's actually spelled that where the L's are ones. It's like Tolt Ally supposed to be. And I'll try to write it in the chat. But it's a Chrome extension, and basically it's just it kind of does what like the Wave extension does or Site Improve, but in a more basic format. So it's easy for beginners to use, and I think there's just a couple of options, so it really narrows it down, but it still is a great tool to start making your websites accessible.
Do you have any tools, Tessa?
Yeah, I think I talked a lot about Adobe Acrobat Pro, but I will give a shout out to LibGuides. You know, we all use LibGuides a lot, and I think there are some good accessibility features about creating alt text and providing those different directions. So if that's a tool that you use a lot, you know, there is a lot that you do have to think about in advance. So just making sure that you're following those tools. So yeah, you know, YouTube for captions, Adobe for remediating PDFs. I do think this is kind of tangentially related, but I do believe sometimes if you like embed a PictoChart infographic, you can like have it display on a page, and that can still pick up text from a screen reader, but it doesn't do the alt text. So that's kind of why I recommend remediating it separately. But yeah, those are kind of the biggest ones that I use.
I like to use the accessibility feature on PowerPoint. I think it's PowerPoint is often missed, but there's a lot of things you can do, and the accessibility feature is really great. I do not only for deaf, but I do other presentations, and I mentioned some of the tools, but there's quite a few that are out there. I do like Google has a lot of different applications that are very user-friendly for persons who have disabilities.
I did not know about the PowerPoint one. That's good to know.
I think Google Slides also has some accessibility features. I haven't used them as much myself. I don't tend to do a lot of like synchronous instruction at the moment, but there are definitely areas in Google Slides, like, you know, they do like live captioning as well. I know Zoom does that as well, but that's another important part if you're providing your slides to students, which is another part of accessibility, right? Providing them ahead of time or after the session so students can really take it at their own pace and have that takeaway object that they can learn from. So I'm guilty of this a lot of times. So I usually have like images as my slides, but if I'm going to share them out, I kind of have to recreate them and make them more accessible.
Okay, the next question is, what's your biggest piece of advice for libraries wanting to incorporate accessibility and inclusion into their online instruction? Darlene, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, providing support for professional development is really important, right? To allow librarians to learn about accessibility. Unfortunately, it's not like you're taught this in school. So it's really about taking the steps to learn it yourself. But of course, that takes time. In our library, we've just formed the DEIA committee. And that's just a great way to keep the conversation going and have somebody that's kind of accountable for teaching or to encourage others to learn more about accessibility. I really feel like there has to be a person at the library whose job it is. We have a committee, which is good enough, but ideally we would have an accessibility librarian, somebody who had a disability that could encourage others, teach about accessibility, and monitor the accessibility of our library.
Tessa?
Yeah, this is kind of a tough question because I'll echo Darlene too, like learning these tools is definitely good advice. But I think sometimes we get really caught up in like technical requirements for accessibility. So of course we have these guidelines like web accessibility contents for the web. And those technical requirements are important, right? And we can use these manual checks to check for accessibility, but really thinking holistically about accessibility and taking accessibility as like a pedagogy. I know we're focusing a lot on the tools today, but we mentioned some other things like writing for the web or some other kind of like UDL and things like that. So really thinking about accessibility holistically, I think is helpful. And we're not perfect, right? Do what you can, right? Don't get caught up if you can't do everything or if it's not perfect. Really, it's an ongoing process of learning these different tools and incorporating them as much as you can.
Elizabeth?
Yes. So my advice would be one size does not fit all. And you have to really learn what your students need, what not only your students, your staff, what other people need. And then just putting forth an effort as far as persons with hearing problems, as a person myself with hard of hearing, and I've been since I was a child, so I have adjusted. But seeing other people struggle is very frustrating. And I don't think that, I think we need to pay more attention to providing resources for persons who have disabilities.
Yeah, I think that's why this session was so popular. So the last question is, do libraries require someone such as an online learning librarian or accessibility specialist to approve all digital learning objects before they're published? Or is there another way to ensure accessibility? Darlene?
As I say, not my library. There's no requirement. Really, just I'm known around here as like the accessibility person because I'm always advocating for it. So if someone wanted to ensure that their LibGuide was accessible or any presentation, they would bring it to me. But again, it's not required. I chaired an accessibility task force in our library where we looked at all aspects of accessibility, physical and digital. And our report, in our report, we suggested hiring an accessibility librarian who could manage these things.
Tessa or Elizabeth?
Yeah, I
We
can
don't
just.
have.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll go into order, so you go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I was just going to add that, kind of like what Darlene mentioned, kind of having a point person is really helpful to make some of these guides and tools. I know someone just shared like a LibGuide that had like accessibility requirements. And I think using those separate tools, but also kind of having homegrown ones are helpful as well. So I don't think necessarily you have to be like, I don't know, like the sheriff of accessibility, right? Being a resource, being, a colleague, and really encouraging a culture of making this a part of everyone's job and providing that training for them. So definitely helpful. I'm an online learning librarian, right? That's my primary focus. And I feel like my role is to support other librarians in doing that. And I think that works pretty well. Of course, like I mentioned, it's not always going to be perfect. Some things might slip through the cracks, but that's helpful to have that structure set up.
We don't have a person for accessibility. I've just taken it up upon myself. So I'm just not the sheriff, but I'm passionate about it. So I'm interested in it. And even our disability services person, there's only one person in the disability services office. So that shows a lack, and we need to actually do better. And I'm not sure what other universities do, but I think that it's becoming more critical that we look at the people who are serving disability services.
Okay, so I'm going to get some of the questions that came through chat.
I have some of those, Melissa.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
First, I'm going to put it in the chat again. We're so sorry that Victoria Elmwood could not join us, but she did share her slide deck with us. So I've put that link in the chat. But when Elizabeth Jean was presenting, somebody mentioned about the sign-all program. Wow, that's cool. Is that expensive?
Well, right now we are the only library that has it. We're doing it as a pilot, and we did not pay anything for it. It's created in Hungary by some technology persons who had a deaf employee and decided to go a different route, and they created this technology. They now have an app, which the library was influential in helping to create, and the app is free. And it does the same thing that the sign-all does. And it is really cool.
Okay, thank you. And Tessa, you've been really a ninja catching the questions coming in for you in the chat. But I think you did miss one, which was,
Okay.
should alt text be used when making infographics?
Definitely. Yeah. I think, you want the screen reader to be able to recognize the text, but really creating that equal opportunity for students to learn from visual materials as well. So, it's still text-based, alt text is as well. But like I mentioned, creating that context, it's still a companion to the content, right? So it's adding something to the overall infographic. And I think, all users should be able to learn from that. So again, you're not necessarily saying like, a blue book, right? So you're kind of setting the context of how your illustrations are really expanding on your concept. Like the example that I showed of like those little diagrams, I think that even if that was described with text, that's still going to enhance the learning experience for students. Does that answer your question?
I will see if they reply, but there is another question. A lot of LibGuides and tutorials use screenshots of database screens. Is there a good way to make these more accessible?
Yeah, I think using alt text on the pictures themselves, you can add alt text in LibGuides. You could do that. And I think I had read that question. Somebody, the follow-up was if they should make a video instead. And I guess that depends on if you're showing a process, then I would recommend going with a video where you can explain, this button is on the top right or something like that.
Okay, thank you. We have a new question in. What about neurodiversity and accessibility? Are there shared considerations? I feel like this is a large, invisible, hard to count population.
I can chime in on that one. I know with the people like with autism, they like things straightforward. So a good tip is to just not use like idioms, sayings where you think everybody understands that. And actually that would go for people with that don't have English as their first language too. Just be straightforward in your language.
I just want to comment on that as well. A lot of deaf individuals have other handicaps as well, and that is, and some of the same things that you would do for deaf individuals work very well with other disabilities.
I'll just add, this isn't my area of expertise, so I won't talk too much about it, but I want to draw back, universal design for learning as like a good framework for ensuring accessibility for neurodivergent people, right? So really providing options of what people might feel most comfortable sharing, or that multiple means of representation. I think that's a good, overall framework to follow that would help users with neurodiversity as well.
Those are all the unaddressed questions in chat that I saw so far. Audience members, please continue to add questions. We have lots of time.
There was a question, is the app called Sign-all?
Yes.
Is that how you spell it? Sign-all?
Yes. SIGNAL. And I think I put in the LibGuide, I have a LibGuide. You can go to my LibGuide and there's a presentation and I think there's a video and it explains a little
You
bit
put
more.
that in the chat, right? Your link.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And don't forget about the feedback form that was just shared in chat. And if you have any other questions, we have a little bit of time, I think.
I just also want to say thank you for everyone sharing additional resources in the chat. I think that's a great forum for this. You know, we're kind of up here sharing our advice, but we're really learning from y'all too. So thank you so much.
We have a new question that just came in. Someone said to avoid flashing items. Do people have opinions on GIFs?
They're not great for learning. I would avoid those. Yeah, flashing items are, it's a best practice to always let the learner be in control of the media. So including like videos, you should always include the pause and play buttons so they can stop it if they need to. And you can't stop GIFs. So.
There's a new question. I use PowerPoint's accessibility checker, but I also like using PowerPoint Smart Art. Do you know if their Smart Art charts are accessible?
Typically using the built-in functions of the application, whether that's Word or PowerPoint, that tends to be accessible. So I think Tessa, you said, you know, use bullet points, use, you know, don't create your own bullet points, but use the button that says, you know, for bullet points for creating those. And that just applies to everything else. For indents, there are indent buttons or there are line spacing buttons. Use those rather than just pressing enter and try to create your own spaces. That tends to be more accessible.
Someone in chat said in another accessibility session, it was important to use alt text for Smart Art. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to interpret.
I recommend that everybody go to, if you have your PowerPoint, or you can open up one later. If you go to review, there is a check accessibility, and that should work with Smart Art to tell you if you need to put alt text in Smart Art. It usually catches alt text and reading order really well.
I like using the, as I already mentioned, that using it because it goes by, you can do your pictures, your graphs, everything, and it will tell you what's wrong with it and then how to fix it. So it's, I like that in PowerPoint.
We have some comments about tables and how they're really hard for screen readers. Do you have any suggestions of maybe not using a table or using something else besides a table?
I would say, yeah, if you can use something else, it would be best. Just remember that the way the screen readers read it is from left to right and up down. So sometimes you think it's being read in a certain way, but it's just really not. So redesigning the table just to maybe include, I had a redesign on my LibGuide where we did this, but basically they were saying kind of like a primary, secondary, tertiary, and then on another cell, they had the descriptions, but that's not how it was read, right? It wasn't read primary with the description of it. It wasn't read secondary with the description. It was read primary, secondary, tertiary, and then the descriptions were read, right? Because it goes from left to right. So instead, putting that entire description along with the name in a cell would have worked better. So it'd be primary along with its description, and then secondary along with the description, all in one cell. That worked better. So if you can try to keep that in mind, that'll work. But doing something other than a table would probably be suggested.
So we're winding down. If you have any other questions, I would suggest emailing one of the presenters. They seem pretty knowledgeable about all of your questions. And then, you know, there were some answering others' questions in chat as well. There's another question. Has anyone found a preference for annotated screenshots or video tutorials? Someone's having a hard time choosing, especially tutorials about database searches.
Yeah, I would go back to UDL, right? So all of them, right? Like a screenshot and a video and an interactive tutorial. Like I think, especially for searching, you know, you can't necessarily provide multiple means of representation for all information literacy topics. But since our work does so heavily focus on database searching, I would do them all. And I have, yeah.
So don't forget to fill out our feedback form. There was a link to it in the chat, and we can send that link again. There it is right there. And Darlene, did you have something to say?
I was just going to agree with Tessa. But then also I feel like it depends on the complexity of what you're showing, of the process. If it's a bit more complex, then I would suggest going with the video.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate your attendance. And unless there's any other questions, we will end this presentation.
Thank you.